the late 1990s, there was a short list of things you did not do in the music business. You did not sue your record label if you wanted to keep working. You did not cross Interscope. And above all, you did not say the name Suge Knight out loud unless you were praising him. Grown men who had survived actual street wars would lower their voices when he walked into a room. Executives took meetings with him only in public places, in daylight, with witnesses. One of the most powerful producers alive walked away from tens of millions of dollars just to get out of business with him. And then, a skinny, bleach-blonde battle rapper from a trailer park outside Detroit showed up, signed with the man Suge Knight hated most in the world, started selling more records than anyone in the history of the genre, and never once flinched. Why? Why did Eminem, of all people, never seem to fear the man who terrified an entire industry? The easy answer is that Eminem was crazy, that he simply didn't care. And there's a piece of truth in that, which we'll get to. But the real answer is stranger, and much more interesting, because it isn't really a story about courage at all. It's a story about timing, about how power actually works, and about a fear machine that was already rusting from the inside, at the exact moment its most famous target arrived. To understand why Eminem never bowed, you first have to understand what everyone else was bowing to, and whether the thing they feared was even still there by the time Marshall Mathers picked up a microphone. So let's start with the monster itself. Marion Hugh Knight Jr. was born in Compton in 1965, and here is the first thing most people get wrong about him. He was not a gangster who wandered into music. He was, for most of his early life, the good kid. His nickname, Suge, came from Sugar Bear, a term of affection from his family. He was a star football player, first at Linwood High, then at El Camino College, then at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he was respected enough that people who knew him then describe a disciplined, even likable young man. He got a brief taste of the NFL as a replacement player for the Los Angeles Rams during the 1987 players' strike. When football ended, he did what a lot of enormous, imposing men do in Los Angeles. He became a bodyguard, working security for celebrities including the R&B star Bobby Brown. And that job taught him something that would define the rest of his life. Standing next to famous people, Suge Knight learned that the entertainment industry runs on paper, and that the people who sign the paper are often young, desperate, and badly advised. He watched artists make fortunes for other men. He decided he would be one of the other men. His first famous move tells you everything about his method. Around 1990, a young white rapper named Vanilla Ice had the biggest song in the country, Ice Ice Baby. Suge believed one of his clients, a writer named Mario Johnson, deserved credit and money from that record. So Suge did not send a lawyer. According to the story Vanilla Ice himself has told for decades, Suge and his men showed up, repeatedly, uninvited. At a hotel in Los Angeles, Suge took him out onto a balcony, 15 floors up, and let him look down at the street, while they discussed publishing rights. Vanilla Ice has given different versions over the years, sometimes saying he was dangled over the edge, sometimes insisting he was only shown the view and invited to use his imagination. Either way, he signed the papers. Millions of dollars in publishing changed hands without a single courtroom. Notice what actually happened there, because it's the key to everything that follows. Suge Knight discovered that in the music business, the threat of violence worked better than violence itself. The story of the balcony did more for him than the balcony did. Fear, it turns out, is a franchise. It travels. It walks into rooms before you do. In 1991, Suge put that franchise to work on the deal that made him. Dr. Dre, the sonic architect of NWA, was trapped in a contract with Ruthless Records, the label run by his groupmate Eazy-E and manager Jerry Heller. Dre felt robbed. Suge offered to set him free. Eazy-E later alleged in legal filings and interviews that he was lured to a studio meeting where Suge's associates were waiting with pipes and bats, and that he was pressured into signing away Dre and other artists after threats were made against his mother. Suge always laughed the story off, but the releases got signed. And out of that meeting, Death Row Records was born, reportedly with startup money connected to a jailed drug trafficker named Michael Harris, a claim that would haunt the label in court for years. What happened next is the part nobody disputes, because you can still hear it. The Chronic in 1992, Snoop's Doggy Style in 1993, which arrived at #1 and made a 22-year-old from Long Beach the biggest star in rap. Death Row wasn't just successful. For about 4 years, it was the center of American popular music. The G-Funk sound coming out of that building, whining synthesizers over lazy, menacing bass, became the soundtrack of the decade. The money poured in through Interscope Records, the ambitious label run by Jimmy Iovine, which distributed Death Row and kept a nervous, profitable distance from how Suge ran it. And how did Suge run it? Like a territory. The label's offices and studios were decorated in red, the color of the Bloods affiliated set Suge kept around him. Employees, artists, and visiting executives later described in lawsuits and sworn testimony a workplace where people were beaten in and around the studio while music played, where punishment was casual and public, and where the boss kept exotic fish and, by many accounts, enjoyed letting visitors wonder what else he kept. Some of the wilder stories are probably embellished. That's the point. Suge never had to confirm anything. Every rumor was free advertising for the only product he ever really sold, which was fear. By August of 1995, he was confident enough to declare war on national television. At the Source Awards in New York, in the middle of enemy territory, Suge took the stage and invited any artist tired of an executive dancing in their videos to come sign with Death Row. Everyone in the building knew he meant Puffy, Sean Combs of Bad Boy Records. The crowd booed. Suge didn't blink. That single taunt helped ignite the East Coast versus West Coast feud that would consume hip-hop for the next 2 years, and eventually consume Death Row too. 2 months later, Suge made his masterstroke, and if you want to understand his genius, it's this move, not any beating. That shows it. Tupac Shakur, the most magnetic rapper alive, was sitting in a New York prison, broke, appealing a conviction, abandoned, as he saw it, by the industry. Suge arranged for his bail, a bond north of $1 million, and flew him out on a private jet. In exchange, Tupac signed a handwritten contract, just a few pages, binding him to Death Row. Think about what that deal really was. It looked like a rescue. It was a leash. Tupac walked out of prison owing his freedom to Suge Knight, and he spent the last 11 months of his life recording at a furious, almost frantic pace, as if he understood exactly what kind of arrangement he had entered. At the start of 1996, Death Row looked invincible. All Eyes on Me sold 500,000 copies in a week. The label was reportedly worth hundreds of millions. Suge Knight was 30 years old, and by reputation, the most feared man in the American music business. He had less than a year left. Here is the misconception at the heart of this whole story. People imagine Suge Knight's reign as this long, dark decade stretching over hip-hop. It wasn't. The empire, at full strength, lasted roughly 4 years. And the beginning of the end came not from an enemy, but from the man who built the sound. By early 1996, Dr. Dre wanted out. He was tired of the gang atmosphere, tired of the violence bleeding into the workplace, tired of watching sessions turn into ambushes. And here's the detail that should reframe how you think about fear in this story. Dr. Dre, a co-founder of the label, one of the most valuable producers on the planet, did not negotiate his exit. He walked away and left essentially everything on the table. His stake in the company, his master recordings, the catalog he had built with his own hands. He handed it all to Suge, just to leave in peace. Suge responded by mocking him publicly, questioning his manhood in interviews, treating the departure as proof of weakness. Dre said almost nothing. He went off and founded a new label under Interscope. He called it Aftermath. Remember that transaction, because Eminem enters this story through the door Dre paid so dearly to walk through. And the price Dre paid tells you what everyone in 1996 believed, that the only way to deal with Suge Knight was to give him what he wanted and get out of range. Then came Las Vegas. September 7th, 1996. Mike Tyson fight at the MGM Grand. In the casino afterward, Suge's entourage, with Tupac at the front, stomped a Compton Crip named Orlando Anderson on camera, a beating captured by security footage that would prove catastrophic because Suge was on probation for a previous assault. Hours later, on Las Vegas Boulevard, a white Cadillac pulled up alongside the BMW Suge was driving, with Tupac in the passenger seat, and someone opened fire. Tupac Shakur died 6 days later. He was 25. Suge, grazed in the head, survived, and liked to tell interviewers he'd taken a bullet in the skull and kept driving. Even his survival became a legend he could spend. But the casino footage did what no rival ever could. In February 1997, a judge sent Suge Knight to prison for 9 years for violating his probation. And with that, the fear machine lost its engine. Because here's what the mythology always leaves out. Intimidation is not a spell. It's a service that requires constant physical delivery. It needs the man himself, showing up unannounced, filling doorways, making people do arithmetic about their own bodies. From a cell, Suge could still make phone calls. What he could not do was appear. Snoop Dogg, the label's remaining superstar, read the situation and left for New Orleans, signing with Master P's No Limit Records, a move that would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier. Death Row didn't die overnight. It just stopped mattering, one departure at a time. Now hold that image, Suge Knight in a California prison cell in 1997, and shift your eyes 2,000 miles east to Detroit. Because the timing here is everything, and almost nobody notices it. In the summer of 1997, Marshall Mathers was 24 years old, working minimum wage jobs, living the kind of life where the electricity gets shut off and the daughter's diapers are a budget line. He had released an album, Infinite, that sold so poorly. It barely counts as a release. He had a demo, the Slim Shady EP, full of a new persona he'd invented partly out of rage at his own failure. That fall, he flew to Los Angeles for the Rap Olympics, an annual battle rap competition, and finished second. A result he took as one more humiliation. But people from Interscope were in that room. The EP made its way to Jimmy Iovine, and Iovine played it for Dr. Dre, who has described stopping the tape and demanding to know who it was, insisting they find him immediately. In early 1998, Dre signed Eminem to Aftermath. Now do the math that historians of this feud almost never do. Eminem signed with Dre in 1998. The Slim Shady LP exploded in February 1999. The Marshall Mathers LP sold 1.76 million copies in its first week in May 2000. At the time, the fastest-selling solo album ever measured by SoundScan. Suge Knight was released from prison in August 2001. Every single rung of Eminem's climb, the signing, the first smash, the biggest album of his life, the moment he became the best-selling artist in the world, happened while Suge Knight was behind bars. So part of the answer to our question turns out to be almost embarrassingly simple. Why didn't Eminem fear Suge Knight the way everyone else did? Because everyone else had learned their fear in person between 1992 and 1996, when a visit from Suge was a live possibility. Eminem never took that class. The man was in prison for the entirety of his rise. By the time Suge walked out of Mule Creek State Prison, the balance of power hadn't shifted. It had inverted. But timing alone doesn't explain it, because plenty of people stayed afraid of Suge even from a distance, even while he was locked up, even after. To understand why Eminem specifically was immune, you have to look at the psychology of intimidation itself, and at the very strange psychology of Marshall Mathers. Intimidation, at its core, is a negotiation over imagination. The intimidator doesn't actually promise violence. He invites you to imagine it, and then lets you frighten yourself, which means it works best on people with something concrete to protect, and a vivid picture of losing it. A career, a reputation, a comfortable life, a self-image as someone respected. Suge's genius was picking targets rich in exactly those assets. Young artists terrified of losing their one shot. Executives with families and mortgages, and no experience of physical danger. People, in other words, with a gap between the world they lived in and the world Suge came from. A gap their imaginations would fill with horrors on his behalf. Eminem had no such gap. This is a man who grew up getting beaten so badly at school that one attack, by a bully he later named on record, left him with a cerebral hemorrhage. Who moved through some of the roughest neighborhoods of Detroit as the white kid, the permanent outsider, the walking target. Whose family life was chaos, whose best friend would be shot to death, who had already survived his own suicide attempt after Infinite flopped. By the time fame arrived, Marshall Mathers had spent 2 decades being threatened by people who, unlike music executives, actually followed through. You cannot invite a man like that to imagine violence. He doesn't have to imagine it. It's just Tuesday. And there was a second layer of armor. One that's easy to miss because it looks like comedy. Eminem's entire artistic persona was built on preemptive self-destruction. Think about what he actually did on those first 2 albums. He called himself white trash. He rapped about his own failures, his debts, his mother's lawsuits, his wife, his ugliness, his misery, in more brutal terms than any enemy ever managed. Battle rap, the world that formed him, runs on a simple principle. Whoever can be embarrassed loses. Eminem's solution was to make himself embarrassable by saying the worst things first. Now consider what intimidation requires. It requires a victim who wants to protect an image. Eminem had publicly incinerated his own image as a career strategy. Suge Knight's whole method was designed to threaten what a man was afraid to lose, and here was a man who had monetized having nothing to lose. The weapon simply had no surface to grip. Which is not to say Eminem was reckless about danger, and here's a wrinkle that complicates the fearless caricature. In the summer of 2000, at the peak of his fame, Eminem was arrested twice in 2 days on weapons charges. Once after a confrontation outside a Detroit club where he'd seen his wife with another man, once after an argument with an associate of the rival group Insane Clown Posse. He was carrying a pistol both times. He rapped constantly in that era about threats, about watching his back, about the paranoia of being famous and hated at once. So the honest picture is not a man who felt no fear. It's a man whose fear response had been calibrated in a much harder environment, and who answered threats the Detroit way, by arming himself and pushing forward, rather than the industry way, by paying tribute and going quiet. There's a difference between fearlessness and a fundamentally different relationship with danger. Eminem had the second one, and against a psychological operator like Suge, it worked even better than the first would have. Then there was Dre, and the Dre factor cuts in a direction most fans get exactly backwards. The assumption is that signing with Dr. Dre put Eminem in Suge's crosshairs, that he inherited a war. He did inherit the hostility. Suge came out of prison in 2001 sneering at both of them in interviews, mocking Dre's masculinity in crude terms, dismissing Eminem, needling them in the press for years. But look at what Suge actually did about it, which was approximately nothing that ever touched Eminem. Because Dre's exit from death row, that surrender of millions we talked about earlier, had an aftermath Suge could not have predicted. Freed from the chaos, Dre built Aftermath into something death row never was, a professionally run hit factory inside one of the most powerful corporate structures in music. By 2001, threatening Eminem didn't mean cornering a hungry kid in a parking lot. It meant attacking the single most profitable asset of Interscope and its parent, the Universal Music Group, a multinational corporation with security consultants, legal departments, and relationships with law enforcement at a moment when the industry and prosecutors had lost all patience with the strong-arm era. The business had changed while Suge was inside. The money had gotten too big, too corporate, too watched. Muscle had been replaced by lawyers, and Suge Knight had spent his life mastering a game whose rules were being retired. And the money itself had switched sides. This is the coldest part of the story. Fear only functions as currency where the frightened party needs something from you. In 1993, artists needed death row. It had the hits, the sound, the momentum. By 2001, Death Row was a catalog company reissuing old Tupac recordings, tangled in lawsuits, hemorrhaging artists, while Aftermath was the future. The Marshall Mathers LP alone was moving more units than Suge's entire operation. Then it got worse for him. In 2002, Eminem and Dre signed a bullet-scarred mixtape phenomenon from Queens named 50 Cent. And suddenly, the shady Aftermath camp had something it had never possessed before. Its own credible, unbothered street presence. A man who had survived 9 gunshots and built his brand on being unintimidatable. The one advantage Suge had ever held over Dre's operation. The implication that his people were harder than your people, quietly, evaporated. Suge kept trying to run the old plays. In 2003, he was back behind bars for a parole violation after assaulting a parking attendant. In November 2004, at the Vibe Awards, as Dr. Dre waited to receive a Lifetime Achievement honor, a man walked up and punched him in the face, igniting a televised brawl. Suge was in the building. Years later, the attacker, Jimmy James Johnson, claimed in an interview that Suge had paid him $5,000 to do it, a claim Suge denied and was never charged over. True or not, notice what the incident had become. In 1993, a Suge Knight message arrived in a private room and changed the course of careers. In 2004, it was a sucker punch at an awards show, denied, litigated, and shrugged off. Dre got his award. Aftermath kept printing money. The Fear franchise had degraded into nuisance. Eminem, for his part, treated Suge in his music exactly the way he treated everyone else who postured at him. As material. No tribute, no diplomacy, no careful silence of the kind the industry had practiced for a decade. And nothing happened. That's the revelation hiding in plain sight at the center of this rivalry. The reason it never became a war is that by the time both men were finally on the board at the same time, one of them no longer had any pieces. The last act removes whatever doubt remained. In 2005, Suge was shot in the leg at a Miami party during MTV Video Music Awards weekend. In 2006, Death Row collapsed into bankruptcy, and in 2009, its catalog, The Chronic, Doggy Style, the crown jewels of the G-Funk era, was auctioned off for roughly $18 million, a fraction of what the label had once been worth in a single good year. Suge drifted through the next decade trailing lawsuits and hospital visits, shot multiple times at a pre-awards party in 2014. Then, in January 2015, came the end. After an argument on the set of a promotional shoot for the film Straight Outta Compton, a movie dramatizing the very history he'd helped create, Suge ran over two men with his truck outside a Compton burger stand, injuring Clee Sloan and killing a local businessman named Terry Carter. In 2018, he pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 28 years. The man who once decided which careers lived or died in Los Angeles will be eligible for release as an old man. Eminem, meanwhile, spent those same years becoming one of the best-selling musicians in recorded history, and to this day speaks of Dr. Dre, the man who lost everything escaping Suge Knight, as the person who saved his life. So we can finally answer the question properly, and the honest answer is that it was never one thing. It was 5 things, arriving at once, interlocking like gears. It was timing, first and always. Suge Knight was in prison for every hour of Eminem's ascent, and fear that is never planted in person grows thin. It was psychology. Eminem was a man whose childhood had immunized him against imagined violence, and whose art had immunized him against humiliation, the two levers every intimidator depends on. It was DRE, whose costly escape in 1996 looked like defeat, and turned out to be the foundation of an empire that could protect its artists with something stronger than muscle. It was the transformation of the industry itself, as hip-hop's money went corporate and global, and the parking lot economics of the early 90s stopped scaling. And it was the decay of the Fear franchise, because reputation is a currency that must be constantly re-earned, and every failed comeback, every shrugged-off punch, every unanswered taunt devalued it further, until the name Suge Knight stopped meaning a knock at the door and started meaning a cautionary tale. Notice what that adds up to. Eminem's confidence was genuine, but it was also, whether he thought of it this way or not, correct. He wasn't ignoring a threat. He was accurately pricing one. The industry kept paying Fear at its 1994 exchange rate for years after the collapse, the way people always overvalue a reputation past its expiration. Eminem, arriving late, with no old debts and no old scars from that particular hand, simply read the number as it actually was. And maybe that's the real lesson buried in one of hip-hop's strangest almost rivalries. Power built on fear looks permanent from the outside, because fear is loud. But it is actually the most fragile kind of power there is, because it lives entirely in other people's minds and dies the moment they stop maintaining it for you. Power built on value, on songs, on catalogs, on the ability to make things people want, compounds quietly for decades. Suge Knight owned the most frightening reputation in music and ended up with nothing, not even the masters he'd taken by force. Dr. Dre gave up everything and ended up with more than death row was ever worth. And Eminem, the kid with nothing to protect and nothing to lose, walked through the middle of it all, untouched. Not because he was too brave to be afraid, but because he arrived at the precise moment in history when the monster everyone still whispered about had already, quietly, ceased to exist. The scariest man in hip-hop never laid a hand on Eminem. The truth is, by the time Eminem mattered, he no longer could.